Hello, everybody, and welcome back. In this video, we are going to close our discussion of the respiratory system by talking about regulation of ventilation. Okay, so like every other system in the body, the respiratory system is regulated, okay? And we regulate our respiratory system with the following goals in mind, okay? So what we want to do, we want to make sure that we are delivering sufficient oxygen to our tissues. We want to make sure that we are removing sufficient carbon dioxide from our tissues. And then finally, we want to make sure that pH is correct, is within the correct range. So around 7.4 in the blood, okay? The way we do this is we monitor these particular variables. We monitor PO2, we monitor PCO2, and we monitor pH. Before we talk about how we do that, what I'd like to do is have you consider these questions here, right? So how would you respond to these stimuli? Decrease PO2, decrease PCO2, decrease pH. So what I mean by how would you respond is basically, would you increase or decrease ventilation in response to these stimuli? So go ahead, hit pause and think over those, and we can come back to it. Okay, so decrease PO2. If your PO2 is low, you're going to want to breathe more. You're going to want to increase your ventilation to bring more O2 into the body. Decrease PCO2. If you have low levels of CO2 in your body, you're going to want to slow down your breathing or decrease your ventilation so that you don't offload as much CO2 from your body. And you might not think that that's all that important, but it actually, because CO2 is so closely tied to pH, it is important to keep your CO2 levels at the right level, okay? Finally, decrease pH. So if your pH has decreased, you're going to want to increase your ventilation. So that one's a little bit tricky. Decreased pH is associated with high CO2. So you might need to refer back to your carbonic anhydrase reaction for that. But yeah, basically, if you have a low pH, that means your CO2 is high. What you want to do is you want to increase your ventilation to bring your CO2 back down, and that's going to bring your pH back up. Okay, so the details of the control of ventilation are actually not that well understood. So I'm not really going to tell you all that much about it, but I will tell you what we know about it, which is basically a little bit about the sensors that we have for sensing these stimuli. Okay, so we have chemoreceptors for sensing our stimuli for ventilation. We have chemoreceptors that are located peripherally, and we have chemoreceptors that are located centrally, meaning in the brain. Okay, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about our peripheral chemoreceptors. Okay, this is just like a little schematic showing you how the peripheral chemoreceptors work. You don't actually need to know these details. It's just kind of a decorative figure here. Okay, so we have chemoreceptors that are located in our aorta and our carotid arteries. Remember, the carotid is like kind of the main branch coming off of the aorta that supplies blood to your brain, basically, or to your head, okay? So those are going to be sensing our stimuli for ventilation. The stimuli that are sensed by our peripheral chemoreceptors are these stimuli. They're going to sense PO2, they're going to sense PCO2, and they're going to sense pH, okay? The peripheral chemoreceptors are only able to sense when our ventilation is too low. So they're only going to send a signal that's going to have us increase our ventilation. Okay, so that was the peripheral chemoreceptors. Now let's take a look at the central chemoreceptors. So we have chemoreceptors in our brain, specifically in a part of our brain called the medulla. Okay. Um, and what they do, they actually only sense PCO2, but indirectly. So they sense PCO2 indirectly by looking at the pH of the cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, so to illustrate this concept, let's take a look at this example here. We have an increased PCO2 in the blood. Take a look at this question. What is that going to do to the pH in the cerebrospinal fluid? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that. Okay, so hopefully you figured out as CO2 goes up, we're going to favor the formation of more hydrogen ion. That's going to make our pH go down. Okay. And that is the stimulus that is detected by our central chemoreceptor. Okay. So that's basically it in terms of what I'm going to tell you about these chemoreceptors. So let's take a look at this diagram to summarize our control of our respiratory, of our ventilation patterns. Okay. So remember, we have our peripheral chemoreceptors, which are going to sense CO2, O2, and pH. Okay. Since they are located peripherally, we are going to need some neurons to carry that message. So those are our afferent sensory neurons. They're going to carry the message to our respiratory control centers in the medulla and the pons of the brain. So this is the part that's like kind of a black box. We don't like fully understand what's going on here. Okay. From there, that center, that respiratory control center, or those control centers in the brain, are going to send messages out through our somatic motor neurons, which are then going to control our respiratory muscles and tell them, in this case, to increase ventilation, because remember that our peripheral chemoreceptors are only sensing when our ventilation is insufficient. Okay, I do want to point out this right here. So I want to remind you that our respiratory muscles are voluntary striated muscles that are controlled by, voluntary skeletal muscles, which are striated, that are controlled by our somatic motor neurons. So voluntary. Okay, next up, we have our central chemoreceptors. Again, those are going to detect our CO2 levels indirectly by detecting the pH of the CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. They're going to send that information locally to this other part of the brain or other part of the medulla and the pons. And then from there, we're going to send signals out through our somatic motor neurons to tell us to either increase or decrease our ventilation according to the stimulus. Finally, last thing is I want to remind you, because our ventilation patterns are controlled by voluntary muscle, we can have some control over this. So we can basically override these kind of reflexive responses by commanding ourselves to breathe more deeply or to stop breathing or to breathe more shallow. Also here, the limbic system is a part of the brain that is responsible for emotion. So I think many of you are familiar with the concept that if you start to freak out, you kind of start to hyperventilate. That's kind of what's going on here. So your limbic system is telling you, telling your respiratory control centers to change your ventilation pattern here.